Hey, good afternoon. It is Sunday, and we're so happy that Denise Davis is here. But first, I have to do the cool introduction because Joe Brooks and the nonprofit Community Works Institute is amazing and allows us to utilize this space. CommunityWorksInstitute.org. If you don't know, now you know, you need to go to the website. They bring the community to the classroom and the classroom to the community. And they do a lot of cool professional development for K through 16 educators. And we have two K through 16 educators online here right now. Please go to communityworksinstitute.org. Check out all their institutes that are coming up. I've spoken at them. Maybe Denise Davis will speak at them. You never know. You never know who's going to speak at them. All right. So I'm Zach Ritter. I am Associate Dean of Students at Cal State Dominguez Hills. And I teach there as well, social justice, diversity stuff in higher ed, write some books, have some big thoughts, do some things with cool people like Denise. And I'm really, really excited about this guest today because she's one of like the smartest, kindest people I know and very giving, like just like, you know, sometimes you see successful people and you know that they might be kind of jerks, but this person is so cool and she's so like from the heart and from the brain. She's so great. Denise Davis, we met at University of Redlands, and you are now a Big Bad Council member at Redlands. But I want you to introduce yourself. Tell the folks who you are.
Thank you so much, Zach, for that lovely and warm introduction. It's so great to be here with you today, one of my dearest friends and colleagues and someone who I equally admire so much. So as you said, I'm on the Redlands City Council. I was elected in 2018, and that's a significant part of my life these days. It's where I put a lot of time and energy, but it's not my only job. Actually, my full-time job, which I also adore, is working at UC Riverside. I've spent my whole career working in higher education at this point, mostly in student affairs. Currently, I'm the director of the Women's Resource Center at UCR. So I'm busy these days, but I have two great, jobs to keep me busy.
That's right. That's right. You run things at the Women's Center at UCR. So, gosh, there's a lot I want to talk with you about. Okay, first, I am, I'm a fan of Bernie Sanders, and you were also a fan of Hillary Clinton, and I also love Hillary.
We're gonna go there right away.
It's gonna go there, right? I was just gonna, and not to be in opposition or something, but what does a brilliant, person like Hillary Clinton do now? Like, what is she doing? Because folks are looking to our leaders for guidance, and I think she does a lot of interesting projects and stuff. So I'm actually curious, what is she doing now that is really kind of exciting?
That's a great question. Well, I think first we should talk about what she has done,
Yep.
right? She has paved the way, like no one else, really. I mean, she's been this incredible trailblazer, and continues to be someone who obviously is not just a trailblazer, but someone who's a resource. Like I see her popping up all the time on different webinars. I think she's still doing foundation work.
Yep.
She did campaigning, for the Biden-Harris ticket. She did some great fundraisers. It was really amazing to see her and Kamala Harris in the same Zoom space. They did an interview with Maya Rudolph and Amy Poehler, and that was really fun, right? So she's staying engaged and involved. And I should say too, like she is someone who I've looked up to for a long time. I grew up in Las Vegas. My mom and my grandfather worked for the Teamsters Union, so they would get a lot of free tickets to mostly Democratic political events. And so Bill and Hillary would come through Vegas a lot when I was younger. And so that's really how I got acquainted with who they were. And so how I started following their career. And people ask me all the time, like, how did you decide on running for office? Because it wasn't something that I thought about, until Hillary's campaign in 2016, right? And that heartbreaking loss, we thought we would see the first female president. Arguably, she was the most qualified candidate we had ever had in history up until that point. And to see her defeat and to see, what happened in that election and obviously post that election, has been a catalyst for so many of us to get off the sidelines and get involved. And actually, this is a great chance to talk about, I haven't had a chance to talk about this book. So I, like a lot of other people, saw that moment as a turning point where I should get involved in politics. And I was also connecting with faculty members. My colleague Jen Marola, who teaches political science at UCR, she was doing great programming with us through the UCR Women's Resource Center around women in politics, around what had happened in the election, around the sexism that Hillary Clinton was experiencing. And so she invited two of her friends and colleagues, Ivy Cargile and Rachel Van Sickle Ward, to come and present as well. And so we were talking in the hallway after one of these programs, and we all had this shared sense of grief and sadness post 2016 election. And they were like, well, we should do something about it. I don't think we're the only people having this experience. And so we ended up creating this edited collection called The Hillary Effect, which was published last year. And it's a collection of essays, people who are academics, people who are moms, people who are dads, people who are just talking from their everyday life perspective about the impact that Hillary Clinton has had. So that was a beautiful project to be able to work on, to sort of put our grief into something productive and something that people can hold and read and think about, from here on out.
I love it. And I think that's so important that I think a lot of people have collective grief right now and not sure, and trauma and not sure what to do with it. So that's beautiful that you all did that. So tell us, we'll work backwards. Tell us a little bit about what made you want to go into politics. And you're saying 2016 is this turning point. It's like, you know what, I have to do something here. Tell us about that.
Mhm. Sure. I mean, like you, Zach, and I think this is one of the reasons why you and I connected initially and why we're still such good friends. I mean, my focus is really around how do we create social change? How do we make the world a more just space for those of us who have been marginalized for one reason or another, right? And so that to me has always been my focus in higher education as well. I've had the privilege of not only working in student affairs, but also teaching in women, gender, and sexuality studies at University of Redlands as an adjunct on and off for the last decade or so. And I love teaching activism classes, right? And I think that seeing what happened in the 2016 election was a wake-up call, right? In the sense that I was doing this work on these campuses, feeling very fulfilled by that. But also a friend of mine said to me, he's like, if you think about getting into politics, you're still doing social change work, but you get to paint with a bigger paintbrush, right? You have a broader impact. And for me, that was one of the turning point phrases that made me think, okay, it's scary, to try something new. But if I really want to achieve my goals of having this impact in the social change arena, why not? Why not put myself out there and see what I can do? And I also feel like it's never been just about me also. It's been about how can I help other women, especially women of color, especially, folks from the LGBTQ community, how can I help these people get elected? So I've had a great time working on campaigns and just volunteering around the clock, trying to get these candidates elected. And also through the work that I get to do in the UCR Women's Resource Center, we really shifted our focus post 2016 because especially on a campus as diverse as UCR is, we have around 88% students of color at the undergraduate level. We have so many first generation students, so many undocumented students. I mean, it's a campus that really felt the impact of that election in a major way. And so we had been, like many people, thinking we might see our first female president. We had been planning this party to celebrate that moment. And then when it didn't happen, we literally had food ordered for 60 people that we had to figure out what to do with that next day after the election. And so we have a very small space, and we had all of these students show up just in mourning, right? Like they didn't know what to do. And we said, we have all this food. And so let's have a conversation. So we had a lunchtime conversation. Our friends across the hall in Asian Pacific student programs let us use their space because we had so many people we couldn't fit them into our space in the Women's Resource Center. So we had this big, you know, conversation where everyone was sitting in a circle and crying and processing their feelings. And that was sort of a light bulb moment for me and my colleagues to say, what can we do as educators, in ethnic and gender programs, people who are very concerned about social justice? What can we do to help empower students who are feeling so disempowered and so terrified
Mm,
in this moment? And so we were able to come up with what's called the Persist Women's Political Engagement Conference. We started it in 2017. It's the first of its kind in the Inland Empire region. It's a conference really that's open to everyone,
mm,
campus, community. This year was great. We've been running it every year. And this year we were able to do it in the online space, obviously because of COVID. And we were able to get sponsorship from other UCs, from the women's and gender centers at most of the other UCs. So it's been great to be able to expand this conference and its reach every year. And to say, like, it is really important for women, for especially women of color, LGBTQ folks, people who are disabled, people who have been left out of the political arena. It's so important for us to get involved.
mm,
And yes, that can look like running for office because that's hugely important, but it doesn't have to look like that. And we're very clear to talk about that at the conference.
mm,
That it can look like working for Planned Parenthood or interning with your state assembly member, can look like working for an environmental justice organization. Like, our message is really identify what you're passionate about and let's help you make the connections to get there. So I've been so grateful and so fulfilled by the opportunity to do this work in the last couple years as well.
mm, mm. Who were some of your influences, inspirations, whether they be teachers or other folks in your K through 16 experience? Because
Yeah.
it seems like there's like a deep, and we talk about this a lot. Like there's a, it's very personal, right? The personal is political, and so there's deep experiences that you had growing up that
Mhm.
shaped who you are. So share some of that.
Absolutely. I grew up in the K through 12 public school system in Las Vegas, and I had amazing teachers there. I was so fortunate. I was a student athlete. I played volleyball and basketball. Had great coaches. Was involved in always in diverse spaces from a young age, which I think was really helpful in my development. But also when I got to the University of Redlands, I met some amazing faculty and staff. As you know, our friend and colleague, Leela Matarao, who is the former Chief Diversity Officer at the University of Redlands, she had such an impact on me. I was very fortunate to meet her in my first year
Mm,
at the university. And she helped me, foster all of these connections with not only the Multicultural Center and the Women's Center, but, she was instrumental in helping us start the Pride Center and start
mm,
associated groups. I co-founded Safe Space Allies, the Gay Straight Alliance on campus. And that was really because of these early conversations with Leela
mm,
and her mentorship. Also, Jennifer Nelson, Director of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, was a huge influence on me. I think she started there my junior year of college. I was
mm,
taking her classes and immediately fell in love with the subject. And
mm.
obviously, it's work I'm still doing to this day because of her influence. So yeah, those people are still in my life to this day, and I'm grateful for their influence. Also, Susan Goldstein from the University of Redlands, she and I taught together. She taught the psychology of prejudice class and let me be her TA.
Mm.
Redlands didn't have a formal system for being a TA. We were able to work it out. So that was an important person in my life as well.
So I'm curious, like with Dr. Nelson or Leela, what were those conversations like, what inspired you in those moments, or how did they kind of push you or bring something out of you?
Mhm. I just remember, I mean, having so many conversations with both of them. I would always just gravitate towards Leela's office and sit there, and we'd have extended conversations for hours. And the message that I got from them and so many other faculty and staff at University of Redlands is, you can do this.
Mm,
Like, you can keep pushing for change, and it's a worthy fight, and it's something you should dedicate your time and energy to. And the great thing about being in a space like University of Redlands was that it was small enough to represent this sort of microcosm of society, right? Like, when you did an activist project, the campus was small enough that you could see the impact. You
mm,
could see people talking about it. in the cafeteria or in the residence halls, and I love that element of going to a small, liberal arts college is you could really have these in-depth conversations with people and see their minds opening up based on the education that was happening, not just in the classroom, but outside of the classroom too. And it was a great place for students to learn how to be activists.
Yeah.
So many protests, both on campus and off campus, that I was able to be involved in as a college student, with support from our faculty and staff, right? I think that was huge in developing the person that I am today.
Mm, 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 mm. So, your parents were they quite working class?
Yeah, I'm the first person in my family to graduate from a four-year institution, and my parents actually met as dealers in a casino. It's a very Las Vegas story. My dad spent his career working in the casino industry, and my mom, like I said, worked for the Teamsters Union. She was a dispatcher for a local that helped people get jobs at union hotels.
Wow.
And my grandfather chartered that union. He also chartered a union for cab drivers. He started off as a cab driver. And so, yes, really different upbringing than a lot of folks, but a clear Las Vegas oriented story.
Mm,
So yeah, I had an interesting childhood growing up there, and I actually ended up in Redlands because they were recruiting me to play basketball. It's the
mm,
only reason I had a reason to know about the University of Redlands. But I actually ended up not playing basketball at U of R. I ended up getting involved in the Women's Center and the Multicultural Center and all of these extracurricular involvements and just playing intramural basketball. But I'm just grateful, for that opportunity that landed me here in Redlands, where I still am today.
mm. So I think growing up in racially and probably class and gender diverse spaces, and also having these experiences that you just mentioned with your parents being working class, do you think sometimes folks don't know that about you, and it can inhibit the way folks approach you? And they're just like, oh, okay, she's this well-educated white woman, and maybe that's all there is to her.
Right.
Is it difficult for you to try to prove yourself in different spaces that there I have a background, there's more going on than meets the eye?
Absolutely. That is a hard conversation. And, as people who have studied social psychology enough to know that people make a lot of assumptions about us, I understand that. But yeah, I think people are often surprised to hear that I'm a first generation college student and that I'm still to this day, I'm still paying off my student loans from my undergraduate degree, which was quite a long time ago at this point. Um, and really, the only reason I was able to go to grad school in London was because of the Redlands Rotary Club. If I hadn't, I had been able to study abroad in London, which was amazing. It was actually a requirement of the program I was in the Johnson Center for Integrative Studies. You had to have a cross-cultural experience.
Mm,
And yeah, I just fell in love with London. And while I was there as an undergraduate, I was going to public lectures at the London School of Economics, and I had this course tutor, this professor from the study abroad program, and she was like, Denise, you should apply to go to grad school there. And I was like, I'm not gonna, I'm not gonna get in there. She's like, no, just do it. You should apply. So I was totally shocked and stunned when my senior year at the U of R, I got an acceptance letter from the London School of Economics to study social and cultural psychology. And that was great. But I also was like, how am I going to be able to afford this? Right.
mhm,
I didn't think it was going to happen.
mm,
So I ended up deferring for a year because there was no immediate way I could go to London.
mm,
And I took a job at the University of Oregon, worked in residence life and housing, which was really, important for me because if I was going to be somewhere outside of, my family's home, I needed to make enough money to live, right? And being in residence life and housing and having a free apartment, that was a great, easy first job that allowed me to, be in a different state. But also while I was in that different state working at the University of Oregon, I was applying frantically for every scholarship possible.
Mm,
Finally, one worked out, and it was a big enough scholarship that it covered all of my tuition and then some. And so that was amazing
mm,
that that came through. And I am always thankful to the Redlands Rotary Club for making that opportunity happen,
mm,
because then I got to go to London, do my master's degree at one of the premier world universities, studying in this city that is, one of my favorite cities in the world because it's one of the most diverse cities in the world,
mm,
right? And so it was just an amazing experience, but also a really hard time for me personally. My dad had just been diagnosed with lung cancer. He insisted that I go to London because he knew what a big deal this was. And it was hard, it was hard. My dad ended up passing away in the middle of my time abroad. So I
mm.
was doing a lot of flying back and forth between London and Las Vegas, and it was just a really emotional time. So it was like the best of times and the worst of times for so many reasons. But yeah, that was a pivotal turning point in my life to have that experience in London, and I'm super grateful for that.
Yeesh. Yeesh. Uh, are there any kind of cute stories with you and your parents? Did they teach you card tricks? Did they teach you like?
No, quite the opposite, because my dad spent his career working in casinos and earning a living that way. He always said to my sister and me, like, "You will never gamble, never, ever." So
Interesting.
they discouraged it. So I feel kind of embarrassed sometimes because people ask me a lot about Las Vegas and gambling, and I know nothing about it, but that was intentional on the part of my parents. But yeah, I feel very fortunate. Someone was telling me yesterday, she's like, "You're so lucky that you have a mom that aligns with you politically," and, I do feel super fortunate about that. Like, my parents have always been, uh, my biggest fans and my biggest supporters, and, even when it was a big risk, my dad didn't want me to go to school in California because he didn't know how we were gonna be able to afford that, and so, yeah, it was hard. He's like, "Why can't you just stay and go to UNLV? It's gonna be so cheap if you would just go to University of Nevada, Las Vegas." But I felt like I needed to have this different experience and always wanted to come to California.
Mm,
But yeah, they've always been so supportive, and I feel fortunate for that.
mm.
They've encouraged my dreams rather than, stood in the way of any of them.
Wow, 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 wow. Um, and I wanna hear more about some of the union stuff, but it'll come up. So let's talk about the elephant in the room. Redlands can be historically can be a conservative place, right?
Mm. Mhm.
And you did something I think very gutsy, and you ran a campaign um, like openly as a queer person.
Mm. Mhm.
How how did I mean, how did that work? And were you scared or concerned that that was going to hurt your political chances, or did you make a decision like, you know what, this is who I am, and this is how it's going to be, and I got to live in my truth?
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. And it still, honestly, to this day, continues to be the elephant in the room. It's still like a really difficult issue, which I'll get into in a minute. But during my process of deciding to run for office, there was never a moment where I thought that I couldn't be open and honest about who I am, right? Because I think for me, why I was running was to be a different type of public servant, right? To be open, to be authentic. And also I came out when I was in college. Like this was not a secret from me.
Mm,
I had plenty of people in my life who already knew. And so it would be weird to not talk about that element of my identity. But I was telling someone this week that, it's not something that I am very comfortable talking about, even though I've been doing it for most of my adult life. Like it's still something that I would rather not talk about, but I feel a deep obligation to
mm,
talk about my identity, especially being the first, right? The first openly queer person who's ever run for the city council in Redlands, and now the first person on the council, right? Like I think it is my deep obligation to pave a way for others.
mm,
Right, and I said that a lot. I love that Kamala Harris, has this powerful quote, "The first, but not the last," because I talked about that a lot during my campaign. I said, "My job is to make sure that I'm not the last
mm,
um, queer person from the LGBTQ community person from a marginalized background, to be on the Redland City Council. And I do a lot of speaking to high school students and college students at this point, and really try to make a point that they can do this. They can run for office and be who they are. And I think that that is hugely important. And they ask great questions too. They say, "Do you face discrimination?" And the answer is yes. There's been harassment from the moment I launched my campaign till today, right? Like there is still a certain level of harassment and just internet trolling, frankly, that is exhausting. And it's hard. It's hard because I feel like I'm constantly having to defend myself. I'm constantly having to push back and educate people. People will say to me, well, all you care about is your agenda, your LGBTQ agenda. And it's like, if you look at my work, it has very little to do with an LGBTQ agenda, but just by talking about it, sometimes it's the focal point, especially in a community that's been, like you said, historically conservative. They don't really know what to do with this. Um, I'm also unmarried, and I think that that's rare too, right? For a person in public office, and people don't know where to place me or what to do with that either. Uh, so it's been difficult, but I'm hoping that people see it as a reason to get more involved rather than less involved. And that's always my fear. Like I don't want people to see what I'm going through and for them to not put themselves out there if they're thinking about it, right? Because I think the more of us who do this, I think the better it's going to be. Eventually, we're going to be more accepted at the table. It's hard when you're the first or the second or the third, right?
Mm-hmm. And I'm sorry you have to go through so much daily discrimination. It's yeah, we keep pushing and wanting the world to change, and it does in some ways, and then in some ways it stays very, very much the same, which is kind of disgusting. But um, so demystify it for folks that are like, well, what does an elected official do? And I've always kind of been interested in doing that. And how do I? You don't have to get into all the how to do it and stuff, but what is like what are the things that you're working on right now that are exciting you,
Mhm.
and what is the day to day for someone who is the director of a women's center and also a politician look like?
Yeah, it's a lot, certainly, because it depends on where you're at, right? We're in a smaller city. The council job only pays $6,000 a year. It's basically a volunteer position. So I absolutely had to have a full-time job, and I'm grateful to have a full-time job that I love so much and that, I've done for long enough to be able to balance both roles, right? Um, but the day to day, it's like it's never ending. If I can take a vacation from my UCR job, and I do here and there, but the council job is never ending. People are emailing every day. People are, writing me messages on Instagram and Facebook, and there's always questions from residents. So I spend a lot of time trying to get answers to questions for people and being that liaison, their representative uh, to in between them and City Hall. So I spend a lot of time communicating with the city manager who communicates with city staff. Um, and this could be everything from, when can I get a speed bump on my street to, that bar is open and they've been open this whole time and they can't be open during COVID. And I'm very worried, like there's so many different types of questions that people ask all the time. And so I'm constantly fielding answers for people. Beyond that, it's a great opportunity and responsibility to be a policymaker. And so I'm always thinking about what policies can we create to improve Redlands and to improve this work, right? And so a policy proposal that I made in the last couple months is I was recognizing that we have a different way of selecting our mayor and mayor pro tem. We don't have an elected mayor. Everyone's elected by district. There are 5 districts. Um, but we have a system in which it's been the same system since the 1950s, actually, in which the council decides amongst ourselves every 2 years who is mayor and mayor pro tem. So
Whoa.
it becomes a, needless to say, it's like a very biased process,
Yeah.
right? And so I was looking around and looking at my friends on other councils. I have all of these great friends now on other councils, and I see these historic firsts happening Christy Holstage in Palm Springs is the mayor. She's the first openly bisexual mayor in the nation. Jocelyn Yao is the mayor of Eastville. She's the youngest woman of color to ever be mayor of a California city. These are great things that are happening in California. And I'm thinking about like what allowed that to happen. And it's because these women are great, first of all, but beyond that, like there are systems in place that rotate people each year through the leadership roles. And so I was proposing a similar system in Redlands, but unfortunately, the men on my council voted that down. So, we need 3 votes on a 5-person council. We got 2 votes. The other woman and I voted for it. But yeah, I'm hopeful that even putting forward more progressive policies like this that are really based in equity and based in eliminating bias as much as possible and giving people opportunities, just putting them forward and starting the conversation is important. And I hope that, I or someone else in the future can pick this up again and try again, right?
So were you trying to have it so that it's just the people would vote for it rather than these folks at the top voting for the mayor?
Actually, there's a lot to unpack there. So no, but I was trying to have it so where we had a 1-year rotation, right? And I had devised a system that was based on fairness of everyone on the council having a chance to be mayor in the next 4 years before everyone's terms expired, everyone who hadn't been mayor. And then after that, I was proposing a rotation by district number, which is how some cities do it. So that way it removes people's names, it removes any type of bias you might have about them from that process. And so you just rotate based on district and people stay in the role for 1 year versus our current 2 years. So it gives more people opportunity to be in leadership. The reason why I was not for an elected mayor model is because California has what's called the California Voting Rights Act, and there are a number of cities who have been sued for violating the California Voting Rights Act because if you're, for example, that was a proposal on the table for us to consider. If we have 5 districts now and we go to 4, and we already have 1 district on the north side of town that's majority Latino, so majority minority district, we're diluting that vote if we make the district larger and go from 5 districts to 4. And so if you're diluting minority votes, then you are potentially in violation of the California Voting Rights Act and could open yourself up to a lawsuit, right? But also we have to think about like who runs for office and who wins those larger at-large seats. It's usually rich white men, right? Historically. So it would be a step backwards, I think. On the surface, it might seem more representative, but if you do more digging, I think this is a better model. We have 5 districts. If we had a rotation of leadership, I think that'd be the most equitable.
Interesting. Okay. I want to ask you about the way you do activism is interesting, and I actually admire it, and I think I do it similarly. You're like the nicest person about and that doesn't mean that being, there's all different ways to be an activist, but I think media portrays activism as someone who's very loud and is very vocal and is trying to tear down structures from the outside, which is also necessary, right? And I think something interesting about the way that you do it is you kind of utilize your intellect, charm, people skills, and obviously policymaking skills to try to like gently or not so gently move people like with a smile on your face, but still getting the work done of being a very strong activist. So how do you do that? Because that is a skill where you're not the type of person that will call someone out or drag someone on social media or make someone feel bad. And not to say that those tactics are not useful at certain times, right? Those are good tactics as well. But you do it in a very unique way. Tell the folks about that.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate all of those observations. And ever since I was a college student, really learning about activism, I've always had more of an inclination to call people in rather than call people out, right? And I think that you're right. There's a place for calling people out, and that's important too. I've just personally always found it to be more successful if I try to call people in and educate folks as much as possible, right? Especially folks who maybe were having a preconceived notion about me or my agenda, right, or my values. It's important to have those conversations and to find common ground because I'm really passionate about that as well. But being over 2 years into my term in elected office, there's a lot that I've learned at this point, and I think that all of the data around success and likability being negatively correlated for women, I can see that, right? I can see why women have a much harder time as they become more successful in the political arena, as they have ambitions or even perceived ambitions, right? People have attacked me recently for, you know, thinking that I might want to run for higher office when I've never said that publicly, right? And so I think that that's what's hard too, is to balance being warm and authentic and trying to bring as many people in as possible, but also recognizing that there's still a great bias towards women in politics and women who are successful in politics. And that's sometimes hard for me to balance. But I think it's important to just keep showing up and being who I am and doing the work that's important to me. And if it resonates with people, that's great. But certainly we're not going to win everyone over, and that's politics, and that's one of the hardest lessons, is that there are just some people who are not going to like you, and you have to be okay with that, right? And I think that for me, it's always a good reminder when those moments happen to just like stay focused on the work
Yeah.
as much as possible. Like always keep coming back to the work, coming back to the reason I'm here, and keep that in mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so let's talk about that real quick because I feel like you and I are very, very, very empathic and sensitive people, and we like harmony, and we want people to feel good about themselves and others, and we want the collective to really work. And I know I'll speak for myself that when I know that there's someone's upset or there's bad vibes coming from someone, my initial reaction is, okay, how do I help you? How do we make it better? Did it something I do? I feel bad now too. And and maybe as an educator, I think that helps us do our jobs. But I wonder as a politician, is that hard to be someone who feels the world very strongly on a high level, and some of these people just want you out of office, and some of them want worse for you, obviously. Is that hard to balance everybody's feelings, emotions, and desires and needs?
So much harder than I could have imagined. Yeah, it's really hard, especially when this isn't my full-time work, right? Like it would be one thing if this were my full-time job and I could focus all my time and energy on it, but it's not,
Mhm.
so it's a lot to have a part-time job that's so physically demanding just in the workload, but also emotionally demanding because you're balancing all of these thoughts and feelings and lies and attacks, frankly, from people. Yeah, it's hard. And I've been talking with some other women who were elected, around the same time as me. I was fortunate to find this great program called Emerge California.
Huh.
They train Democratic women to run for office. It's a 6-month program. I did it as I was running for office. So I had this amazing community of women, like-minded women who are in elected office or who ran for office throughout the state. And so I've been talking with some of them recently about like how difficult it is to be, in this particular moment. And not really have a lot of people who understand this experience. And so that's been really important for me to talk with other women who understand the experience because it's a pretty unique experience. So yeah, I have a great support system in that regard, and that's been more important than ever.
Hmm. Yes, yes, the collective support, and I was just reading an article about the importance of artists, Black artists, at doing a show at MoMA, that they were talking specifically about Black folks, but I would imagine it expands to other marginalized groups, that they have no other choice but to be in a collective. It's for survival, right? Because if you're out on your own fighting these fights, um, you will go insane, and it just doesn't. It's not going to be healthy for anybody. And I think a lot about, Hillary Rodham. Uh, there was, and I see those videotapes of her speaking her mind, being more open, having the big glasses, having the big hair, and talking almost like a university professor in, like a feminist, a feminist, like women's liberation course, and pushing against systems. And then when, as this history, when Bill Clinton didn't win governor, when he ran, I guess, the second time in Arkansas, then she had to change her name to Hillary Rodham Clinton. She had to cut her hair. She had to get rid of the glasses. And I mean, you know this better than I, but this whole thing of society, and usually men telling women how to act, what to do, what to wear, how to sound. Like her whole life, she's kind of like been told, like, do this, don't do that, like be more feminine, no, be less feminine, like. And then people at the end of, or further along in her career, they're like, oh my God, she's so robotic, like I can't really connect with her. And it's like, if you do that to a human and keep, like, make them run through this gauntlet of abuse. I mean, right, let's call it what it is, right? It's an abusive thing. um uh, and then you look at Ocasio-Cortez, who's younger and earlier in her career and is in a different era as well, so she could be more herself, and a bunch of people want her, you know uh to cause her damage, harm, I should say. And then you look at the vice president, and she was able to kind of, I guess, walk that tightrope of being authentic, but also trying to conform to these white dominant male norms. For, I don't know, for your own self, do you see that you have to walk this tightrope?
That's a great question, and that's a hard question. And before I answer that, I just want to give a shout out to all of those women, right? Hillary, AOC, Kamala Harris. I mean, they are paving the way for so many of us. Um, and Hillary in particular, went through a lot of hard times, you're right, with all of those double standards and then being criticized, right? She would conform to what people were asking for, and then they'd criticize her for that, right? And so it just seemed like a no-win situation all the time. She was too emotional, and then as soon as she stopped being emotional, then she's not emotional enough, right? And so it's really been challenging for the women who have come before us, and I want to acknowledge that. Um, and in terms of for me personally, yes and no. I think that, I mean, I've always just liked wearing blazers, and so I think for me, even before politics, this was my sense of style, and so some people like it, some people don't, and that's okay, right? And I think it's important to just show up and be who you are, right? And um, I didn't feel the need to obviously find a partner and get married, right? And I think like some people do when they go into the political arena, right? Because there's so many preconceived notions of like who you have to be successful in politics. But that's just not me, and that's not how I wanted to show up. I wanted to always show up as who I am, and I love organizations that are encouraging women to run as you are, right? Like this is a really key phrase that I keep hearing these days over and over again, like run as you are, because we need more of that. Like we need more people who are running as their authentic selves and not conforming to a norm. And that's how we all get liberated in the political arena. That's how we all become free, and that's how we see more diverse representation at the table, which is so vital for all of us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We haven't talked about UCR and your role there. Tell us, what's exciting you there these days, and how's that going?
Yeah, I'm so grateful to work at UCR. And before that, I spent many years working at University of Redlands and have had great experiences in higher education. I get to work within ethnic and gender programs. So I'm the director of the Women's Resource Center, but we are within a larger umbrella of ethnic and gender programs at UCR. So there's all of these great centers that fall underneath that umbrella. I think really more centers than honestly I've ever seen at any other college campus. And so it's amazing to have all of these colleagues and all of these dedicated professionals in the diversity, equity, and inclusion arena. And to be able to do this work full time feels like a real privilege because it's such important work. But as you know, a lot of times diversity, equity, inclusion is sort of an afterthought in a lot of spaces in higher ed and otherwise. And so it's amazing to be able to do this work full time. I have two great program coordinators who work in the office with me, Monique and Katie, and they're phenomenal. So we've been able to create, even in this pandemic, like a wide variety of online programs and pivot the programming, to meet students where they're at. Um, like I said before, a great example of this is the Persist Women's Political Engagement Conference. We did that on Zoom this fall. Patrice Cullors was one of our keynote speakers. It was just incredible, to be able to have this type of programming in this pandemic. We look forward, obviously, to the day when we can be together again in person, but in the meantime, we're trying to innovate as much as we can. The center has started a podcast, the Feminist Friday podcast. We have talented student workers who are doing that. They're also going to help me create a Persist podcast. So that's something we're working on in the near future. Yeah, it's a great space to be able to do programming for students, but to also I'm on a lot of other task forces and committees. I'm on the Chancellor's Advisory Committee for the Status of Women. I was able to participate in the first ever State of Women report. Our UCR Center for Social Innovation invited the Women's Resource Center to be partners in this report, along with the Women's Foundation of California. So it's been great to be able to do work within the student affairs arena and then in the wider campus and community as well. It's a really good place to be.
Hmm. Wow. Wow. Yeah, whenever I visited the campus, it's a good vibe. It's a good place. So 2021, here we are. Have you been able to get your vaccine?
I have gotten the first dose, and
Okay.
I feel fortunate that as educators, we have been given the opportunity, given the green light to get the vaccine. So I'm in between dose 1 and 2 at the moment.
Yeah, same.
Excellent.
Yeah, and I understand that there's equity issues about the rollout and yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah. Um, what do you kind of see, predict, hope, as some folks, as things start opening up, are we're hoping not to go back to the same normal, because that was quite oppressive to Black and brown and queer folks and poor folks, and the whole well, actually probably a lot of society was impacted by it. Do you think we can get to a new normal or a better normal?
I'm so hopeful about that. And again, I love seeing these posts about, if we go back to normal, what normal was pre-pandemic, like we have failed, right? And I think that this is an amazing opportunity to do things differently going forward. An example of this is on that Chancellor's Advisory Committee that I'm on right now around the status of women. One of our subgroups is talking about flexible work schedules, right? And this has so many equity issues attached to it, especially for women, especially for mothers who have been most impacted during this pandemic, especially women of color, right? And so I am hopeful that these conversations are happening and that will actually change the work, going forward, and change people's ability to access flexible work, right? Now that we know everyone can do work in the remote environment and do it well, in a pandemic, no less, right? In a highly stressful situation. I'm very hopeful that we'll see those types of changes made, not just at UCR, but across the board in every arena where we can. And obviously, there was a lot happening during this pandemic, right? The murder of George Floyd, the Black Lives Matter movement, taking it to the next level in terms of these critical conversations around racial justice and equity. Um, I don't see how we go backwards from that, right? Like we will also have failed if as institutions and as individuals we go backwards. And so it's an encouraging moment because it's one of the first moments where I did see a wide variety of institutions, right? And educational institutions like we work at
Mm,
saying, yes, Black Lives Matter.
mm,
Let's say it loud and proud, and let's, really define what that means
mm.
on our campus and in our communities, right? So I am hopeful, but at the same time, like I know there's a lot of resistance. You
Yeah.
know, there's a lot of backlash and resistance always when you're trying to make change happen.
And as we know, some of these institutions, some of it's lip service, right? Because they're not necessarily changing their systems and how they operate at the admissions level, at the campus org level, at the critical race theory in the classroom level, or changing the board of trustees level. But there are some campuses that are doing some really really cool and dynamic things. I just hope, and I get worried sometimes that some institutions think because they gave some money to the Urban League or NAACP and that they sent out the email saying this is important, that that's where it's going to stop. But I hope, I don't know, I hope it doesn't just stop there. Uh,
Mhm. Yeah, I agree. I agree. I think accountability is really important. And I think people are having those critical conversations more than ever around accountability. And I'm hopeful that that will move us forward in all sorts of spaces.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I'm gonna ask the question, and it's a sensitive one, but do you hope to run for a higher office?
The honest answer is I don't know. I mean, my focus has always been a very clear one to me. No matter what I'm doing, my focus is about how can I make an impact and how can I create positive change. And that could be in the political arena, but it doesn't have to be, right? And so I genuinely don't know. I'm thinking about that carefully, this year and going forward. But yeah, for me at least, that's always been my guiding light. Is like, how can I make an impact and use my life and my skill set to create change where I can. So I'm open to ideas, Zach. Let me know what you think.
Well, I think you would be great in any position that you choose. So I'm a big fan of yours, and I also share that philosophy. I don't know if we ever talked about this, but you just said it. How can I use my life to impact others, shine my light bright? And I think the origin of that is because of so many of the ancestors that I never got to meet were murdered in the war and the Holocaust. And so I kind of feel like an extra duty that my branch of the family survived. And so I'm lucky to be here, right? And so what am I gonna, every day is a gift. So what am I gonna do with it to help others that are continually suffering, traumatized, oppressed? And what role can I do in, we got cast in the cast that I operate in to try to disrupt the cast and also change things and shake things up. We didn't get to talk about our love for teaching, so let's touch on that before we have to leave this space.
Yeah.
You you're a very very dynamic teacher, and I think you're a little bit like me, and you take those all that goodness that you receive from those mentors, and then you kind of unleash it on your students, right? What and you and I are white accomplices that are doing this racial justice work.
Hmm.
Tell us a little bit about how you show up in the classroom and the things that you do with that collective of you and your students to make that magic happen. Like, what is it like? What do you do in the classroom?
Thanks for asking this question. I do love teaching so much, and I feel so fortunate to have taught, really a wide variety of classes, but mostly feminist-oriented classes, right? In women, gender, and sexuality studies. The last class I taught was feminist community engagement, and I love that because this taps into the work that I'm doing, not just at UCR, but also, the work I'm doing in the political arena, like all of these connections that I've made in the community. I was able to put out a call to my network and say, hey, my students are going to be required to do an internship in the community for this class.
Mm,
Come to my class. So right before the pandemic, actually, like during the January, February leading up to the pandemic last March, I had these great guest speakers and these people from a wide variety of fields coming in to talk to my students, and my students had amazing one-on-one or two-on-one connections with them for these internships. And so I love that element of teaching, because I have one particular life experience and skill set, but it's really great to be able to expose the students to much more than just that frame of mind.
mm,
Um,
mm.
but yeah, I love teaching, but I also love learning from students, as you know. Like there's so much that we learn by teaching and being in spaces that we've been able to teach in, right, which are more discussion oriented. There's always something that my students are teaching me as well, and I'm so grateful for that too.
Mhm, mhm. Um, two things. One is I was reading this cool article I was telling you about in the New York Times about how can blackness construct America. It's cool if you get a chance, viewers and everybody. It's by Michael Kimmelman, and there's a really interesting. Amanda Williams, one of the artists, says the word inclusion makes my skin crawl. And I was like, oh, interesting. Okay, that's because DEI, they love inclusion. Instead of so inclusion is tolerating Black folks or minoritized groups. Collectivity is the word that Amanda Williams would like to use more, because collectivity means sharing power, access, and privilege in whatever community, classroom community or administrative community or Redlands community. And she went on to say minoritized communities have to form collectives in order to survive. Um, but I really like that word collectivity rather than inclusion. And I think that's what you and I try to do on the best days in our classrooms is make that collectivity and that synergy happen, and we learn from them as we learn together. What, tell the folks a little bit about you know Chimamanda and Bell Hooks talk about feminism
Mhm.
as being for everybody, right? Because if you really get meta, I guess you could, like, folks are like, if you're a masculinist or you're a feminist or you're both, it just means you want equity for all the different types of genders, right? um why do you think it's so hard for folks to promulgate the notion of feminism and equity?
That's a great question. And I'm glad that you mentioned these amazing Black feminists, because I think that's where we have to start. If we're teaching classes these days, especially, right? We have to be learning from Black women, who have had the most extreme experiences of marginalization and oppression. And I think that's where the word feminism has been troubled over time too, is because it hasn't always been the most collective movement, right? It has excluded women of color in particular, and I think that there's a real reckoning with that, as we move into this current iteration of feminism, right, which is really centering the voices of women of color. I think that that's hugely important in any type of women's and gender studies class, or any space where you're talking about feminism and gender equity work, we have to start there, right? So I'm glad that you brought them up. Um,
Mhm.
I was asked to speak to a high school class last week, and they were talking about Sojourner Truth's anti-woman speech. And
Mhm.
that speech is obviously so powerful. And I'm struck by how much of it resonates today, for better or for worse, mostly for worse. It's just we still have a long way to go, especially when it comes to the liberation and the equity and the support and the uplifting of women of color in our communities.
Yeah, yeah, that is true. Who are some of the authors that excite you in the classroom?
That's a great question. You mentioned bell hooks.
Mm.
These days, I've been trying to keep up with
Yeah,
contemporary works that are not necessarily books, but more articles and journal pieces.
yeah, yeah.
And I love to do an assignment where I have students contribute we do like a media watch assignment.
Mm,
I love to see what's happening, especially because students are on social media so much these days. Even influencers, right? And people who are big on social media have been instrumental in classroom discussions. So when I teach, I often have a segment, towards the end of the class where we talk about what are you seeing out there? Like what's being discussed that intersects with gender equity and with feminism and your sphere, right? Your online sphere. And so I always love to see, what students are bringing in that they could find, not so much on Facebook because they're not on Facebook, but, on Instagram and other spaces, right? I think that's important too. So sometimes I'm more um, invested in current narrative. Obviously, history is hugely important. Trying to think of other authors. Roxane Gay is one of my favorites.
Audre Lorde,
Yes.
Gloria Anzaldúa.
Hmm.
But I think you my friend was telling me Sylvia Winters.
Okay.
Yeah, he was telling me about somebody who was writing in the 80s, 90s. Um, I think you hit on something really interesting. And I know we have to wrap up soon, but academia is oftentimes about these uh, older canonical, but also newer canonical people that wrote amazing things.
Hmm.
Um, oh, Sarah Ahmed, right?
Yeah,
She's really big right now,
absolutely.
right? But I think that's really cool that you are bringing it up to date of like social influencers and amplifying their voices because that's what I mean, I'm sounding old, but that's what the kids are listening to, right?
Mhm.
I-
Right.
so tell us how your students react to that because you are saying all the stuff you're using right now, Instagram, Snapchat, whatever, um, those can TikTok, those can be educational devices.
Mhm. Right. Yeah, and we think about people who are leading movements, right? Like the women from Black Lives Matter. We think about Patrisse Cullors.
Yep.
It was great because as we were bringing her for the conference this past year, UC Santa Barbara was like, we're doing, in our class, we're reading her memoir. So this is perfect timing. You're bringing her to speak. Our students are going to be required to watch her speak at your campus via Zoom because we're reading her book, right? So I love those types of connections, right? That especially people who are leading contemporary movements, um, who have such an amazing presence on social media that students can connect to, but people who also have, taken the time to write a book that students can read as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, you got me excited. You sparked my brain. The Purpose of Power by Alicia Garza. I've been
Mhm.
nerding out a lot with Alicia Garza.
She's amazing.
She's amazing, and then I got all excited because I found out she's Jewish, and I was like, oh my god, this is sister from another mother.
Right.
She she just she made it real plain, and she's like, you know, a lot of white folks think racism is just about calling someone a name or denigrating someone, which is a part of it, obviously. But she defined racism or the systemic racism as rigged rules to benefit a certain group.
Mhm.
And I thought that's just like kind of the clearest version of systemic racism that I've heard. And so the stuff that I've been doing in my work is trying to educate Ashkenazi Jewish folks, other white communities, you know, a bunch of different communities of, so now we know, I mean, you should have known, but now maybe for the first time, now you know about rigged rules. It didn't just happen in Europe with the bad Nazis, right? It's happening here today and tomorrow, unfortunately. Now you know about the rigged rules. What are you going to do about it?
Right.
And right, and you may have more power than someone else because of where you sit on this pyramid to change the rigged rules. And I think that's why I admire the work that you do, because you're not just like me who is philosophizing about it in a classroom. You're actually doing it at UCR, and you're doing it in your elected position, and that's powerful. So you're bridging practice and theory.
Yeah, you do it too in so many ways, Zach. And I'm so excited that you're hosting, these events online and creating these spaces. You absolutely do it. But yeah, so much of what you just said resonated with me, because as I was talking to you before about the proposal, the policy proposal that I got to make on the city council, trying to create a more equitable way to decide on our leadership. This is a prime example of the rigged rules of the game, right? And so that's why it's like really important for people who are justice minded and equity minded to think about running for office.
Yes.
Because there's so many barriers that have been put in place, to keep a certain type of people in and a certain type of people out, and that's in every institution.
And for folks that are listening, how can they get involved to learn how to run in council, districts or whatever?
Yeah, it really depends on your community, but I would say start paying attention, start watching your local city council meetings, connect with council members. That's a good way to learn about what the job is really like. Like I said before, I was fortunate to find Emerge California, which is specifically for Democratic women in California. They're in a number of other states across the country as well. And that's been a really great training program and network of women in elected office. I would say think about like affinity groups. There are different Chicano Latino groups. There are different groups for people of color in politics. There's Democratic and Republican oriented groups. So think about those types of groups as a natural starting place as well. Those groups that you might gravitate to. Those are helpful starting points.
Beautiful, beautiful. Well, that's all the time that we have. Did you want to leave the folks with any words of wisdom or inspiration?
Just keep pushing. I think it's hard when there's backlash, and going through what we've just gone through in the last few years. It's been a rough time in this country for so many people for so many reasons. But let's just keep pushing, because I'm hopeful that in this pandemic, people have had more time to look at their screens and not look away from the atrocities happening in our nation. And I think that there's a consciousness that's been raised during this pandemic, even though it's been hard for all of us. I'm hopeful that, like we talked about, we're going to move forward into a different version of life versus the old normal, right? So let's keep on pushing.
Amen. Amen to that. And you remind me of Arundhati Roy's quote. She's the Indian writer and activist, that if we stop buying what they're selling, a new world is possible. And on a quiet day, I can hear her breathing, right? Something like that. It's really beautiful. But a new world is possible, right? And we got to keep pushing for that. Denise Davis, thank you so much for being here. This has been a real pleasure. And stick around. You and I can talk a little bit after. But thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you, Zach.
Thank you. Thank you. CommunityWorksInstitute.org. Check us out. CWI Spotlight Series I do the Sunday shows. Joe Brooks does the Friday shows, and check out their website for K through 16 educators and professional development opportunities. And you didn't even mention that I was wearing a dinosaur shirt today. I don't know what happened to my wardrobe, but my mother wouldn't let me out of the house with this. But I just
You
thought it was the right thing to do today.
are stylish as always. I love it, Zach.
Love you. Let's talk soon.
Love you too. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.